We're joined by a very special guest this week. He is an Israeli activist and the son of the current prime minister of Israel. That would be Yair Netanyahu. Yair, thank you so much for joining the Josh Hammer Show.
Thank you, Josh, for having me.
You bet. So it's been 4 months now since October 7th, 2023, a day that will live in infamy for the Jewish people. Frankly, a day that will live in infamy, I would argue, for Western civilization as a whole. What has surprised you in the aftermath of October 7th? Have there been any specific trend lines, whether it's public opinion, whether it's governments who have been stronger or softer when it comes to this conflict that you might support? What has your initial shock value been when it comes to the fallout of October 7th and the war that is now going on?
Well, I think my biggest shock is, the Jewish people in Israel has been through the most horrible massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It's been Israel's version for 9/11, and although less people died, 1,500 people were murdered at that day, but our population is only 9 million, while America's is 300 million. So proportionally, it's like I think 30,000 people would have been killed on 9/11. And, the terrorists didn't hide what they're doing. They were wearing GoPro on their forehead and broadcasting live the massacre, the mass raping, the mass torturing of children and babies and women, and all live to see. So it's not like, I don't understand how could there be narratives that this is not what happened. Well, they were very proud of what they were doing. And the result of this biggest massacre of Jews in recent history is a huge wave of anti-Semitism. Instead of, after 9/11, the whole world united, rightfully so, with the United States and supported the United States. And, huge wave of empathy was rightfully been across the world for the United States, and huge support for the United States, including when the United States retaliated 9/11 and went to the other side of the world, to Afghanistan, to bring down the government of the Taliban that was hosting the 9/11, Al-Qaeda terrorist. So, and I don't, not only that it's not happening with Israel, it's the opposite happening. It's the biggest wave of anti-Semitism, I think, since the 1940s, especially in the West. And it's shocking, especially it's shocking when it's happening in the United States. I think it's the worst wave of anti-Semitism ever occurred in the history of the United States. And we're living in a time that everything is, you're supposed to be like, everything is racist, and you need to be very careful, and everything is very racist. But there is one form of racism that is completely acceptable in today's woke progressive world and in America, which is anti-Semitism. Calling for the genocide of a whole nation is acceptable, apparently, in the United States top universities, as we saw in the hearing in Congress. And it's shocking. And it's shocking that, well, for me, it's not shocking that this wave of anti-Semitism mostly from the camp that says that they are fighting against racism and against discrimination of minorities. And I think there's not Jews are less than 2% of the population of the United States. That's a real minority. Like,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
minority.
Yeah, I think it was Ben Shapiro who was doing a media hit a decade ago. And if I have the quote correctly, I remember Ben saying that Jew hatred is the last politically correct form of bigotry that exists in America. And it's true. It is absolutely true. I mean, you might argue that anti-Christian animus is definitely vogue. It is popular these days, equally disgusting, I would say. But it really is true that Jew hatred is by far the most politically popular, not just politically acceptable, but politically popular form of bigotry. And, that kind of gets us, and you were touching on this. This kind of gets us to this whole idea of intersectionality and DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. You mentioned the university professors' testimonies, Harvard, Penn, these so-called elite institutions, which are very much ground zero when it comes to the fight against DEI and wokeism and intersectionality. Do you think that Jews get it at this point when it was, especially in America and throughout the West, when it comes to the idea that this whole ideology that is essentially ranking hierarchies of victimhood, hierarchies of oppression. Do you think they get it that when it comes to the Jews, even though historically we are the most oppressed people of all time, do you think they understand that according to this ideology that we're not, that we are oppressors?
I sure hope so. I mean, I hear more and more stories of liberal Jews in the United States that describe themselves as progressives and woke that march, with Black Lives Matters and march with all of these people. And now they see their friends that they marched with and they supported their struggles, not only not supporting their struggle, but calling for their annihilation and for their murder. People that they thought that they are on the same side, that they're in the same camp, that they are friends, that they are, and they turn out to be not so friendly. And I hope the reassessment who are the friends of the Jewish people and who are not.
So let's transition a little bit here. I don't want to get too in the weeds when it comes to the Biden administration's foreign policy, but certainly I think it's fair and reasonable at a time like this to compare the Biden administration's foreign policy with the Trump administration's foreign policy. Now, under the Trump administration, you had relative stability in the Middle East, which is obviously an incredibly volatile region historically. You had this landmark historic achievement, the Abraham Accords, where Israel achieved four separate peace agreements. The first with the Arab countries since the 1990s when it was with Jordan. Just unbelievable stuff. How do you assess the differences between the Trump administration's approach to the region versus the Biden administration's approach? And what from your perspective has gone so wrong when it comes to America's involvement or lack thereof in the Middle East?
The source of all chaos in the Middle East and violence and terrorism is Iran. This war is not Israel-Gaza war. It's Israel-Iran war, and Iran is Gaza and Hamas. The terror organization of Hamas is one proxy of Iran. Hezbollah in Lebanon is another proxy. The Houthis in Yemen that are disrupting the whole international maritime trade is another proxy. And when, the previous administration was very tough on Iran and understood that Iran is the source of all problems and of the Middle East and all they're the source of of all chaos in the Middle East and terrorism, not only against, and they're an enemy not only of Israel and the United States. They're calling Israel the small Satan and America the big Satan, but also most of the Arab countries in the Middle East. They're a tremendous threat for them as well. And the previous administration was very tough on them and put sanctions on them that was very close to crippling their economy and collapsing their economy and they changed course. They were scared. They were afraid of the United States, and they kept quiet. And when they kept quiet and being in check, contained. So Israel, the Middle East flourished, and Israel, together with my father and President Trump, made four historical peace treaties between Israel and four Arab Muslim countries, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. And we were very close to a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia as well, which is the most important Arab Muslim country in the world. And, I think, in recent years, there is a different approach of America towards Iran. And I think that is the source of all problems in the Middle East.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Iran is the head of the snake, as I think many in the IDF refer to it. I think some in the U.S. understand that Iran is the head of the snake as well, Yair. So, looking at the fallout after October 7th, you've seen some different trends. On the left, you have what some refer to as this red-green alliance between the woke social justice activists, the same folks who were out there marching for Black Lives Matter in 2020. They were out there with the Women's March in 2017. They basically just adopt whatever is the current cause of the day. Now they are out there marching for the so-called Palestinian cause. On the other hand, you have seen the rise of a segment within the right, within the American right, and to an extent, perhaps the global right, that is sounding a lot like Charles Lindbergh, a lot like the old kind of 1920s, 1930s era isolationist. And, I'm very far from a neoconservative, but I'm also very far from an isolationist. I think that there was a middle ground there. So what would be your response to both of these camps? I mean, both of these camps seem to have some glaring logical fallacies, some logical inconsistencies. So why don't you kind of take those one at a time and explain what's wrong with both of those?
So regarding the woke progressing camp, it's quite ironic that they're siding now with the Palestinians. I saw a group called Queers for Palestine, which is like
Chickens for
chicken.
Chick-fil-A, right?
Yeah, exactly. Chickens for KFC or something like that. Because in the Palestinian territories, being gay is punishable by death, and they execute it quite often. It's not just theoretically. Actually, LGBT people from the Palestinian Authority flee to Israel and get a refugee status in Israel because they know that they will be safe in Israel, and they'll be killed and murdered and probably beheaded in their hometown in the Palestinian Authority or in Gaza. Uh, Women, these people claim they support women equality and feminism in the Palestinian territories, in the Palestinian, in the West Bank and in Gaza. The woman is officially, according to the law, the position of the men, either her father or her husband, and the man is there's no problem if a father or if a husband decided to murder his wife or daughter on, basis, and it's called family honor killing, because this poor lady was caught holding hands with somebody or talking to some guy or whatever. So, and it's legal. It's almost, women are like a furniture or something for the men, according to law. And of course, all minorities are being persecuted. Christians are being persecuted and ethnically cleansed throughout the Middle East and in the Palestinian Authority in every place except of Israel in the Middle East. So it's quite ironic. They're setting up with the most not progressive, but regressive, the most Middle Ages, kind of people that want to bring back the world to the time of the Middle Ages, to the 7th century, where, the Sharia law is in charge and women are not allowed to show their hair in public. Maybe wear a veil, not allowed to show anything besides their eyes in public. And it's quite ironic that they're siding with these people that hate them and hate Christians and hate white people in general and hate, everything. They hate America. They hate, you got in 9/11, when there was 9/11, there is a Fox report that you can find it on YouTube that shows the celebrations in the Palestinian Authority
That's right.
of 11. They were celebrating, and bin Laden is a big hero in the Palestinian Authority. Apparently now in the United States too, in TikTok, with Gen Z, he's a unpredicted hero in Gen Z, but so that's for that side. While Israel is, of course, the most, the only democracy in the Middle East, the only liberal country in the Middle East where, gays are, we have a gay Speaker of the House in Israel. We have the biggest gay parade in the Middle East. We had a woman prime minister, full woman equality, of course, and et cetera, and full minority rights for Muslims, for Christians, for everybody. They go all the way to the higher ranks in the government, in parliaments, and the Supreme Court, and everywhere. Full civil rights, of course. Okay, so that's regarding the Red-Green Alliance. Regarding the new isolationist voices in the conservative side, the United States is the greatest power in the world, the greatest superpower in the world, and the great superpower could walk and chew gum at the same time. We saw with the Trump administration, the border was closed, the southern border was closed. There was hardly any illegal immigrants at the time of Trump administration. And at the same time, the Trump administration was very actively involved in foreign affairs, including containing Iran and bringing the peace accords together with my father to the Middle East, and doing other stuff, of course, in other regions out of the Middle East. So it's not either or. You can do both. Iran already have Israel way inside their range of all of their missiles. but they're building ICBMs, which is intercontinental missiles that can reach to the eastern coast of the United States. It's a fact. They're not hiding it. They're actually bragging about it. And this ICBMs will be able to carry a nuclear weapon. And they're very close to having a nuclear weapon. And the reason they don't need this ICBMs to get to Israel. They can get to Israel with their missiles, with their current missiles. They need it in order to get to the eastern coast of the United States. So Iran is a huge, think about ISIS. ISIS was a problem. Everybody understood that ISIS is a problem for America, although it's in the Middle East. Iran has the same ideology of ISIS, but with all tons of oil and on the verge of having a nuclear weapon. So if ISIS, this small group relatively of terrorists with sandals and Kalashnikovs are a threat to America, so a country with 80 million people, with a big chunk of the world oil on the verge of having a nuclear weapon, building intercontinental missiles that can reach to the East Coast, it's definitely a problem to America, not just for Israel.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm so happy that you mentioned the Trump administration's foreign policy as walking and chewing gum at the same time, because as I've explained on this show, I mean, this idea that the Trump administration's foreign policy was this Ron Paul isolationism, it's totally insane. I mean, they showed restraint at times. They also were very vigorous at times. I mean, just ask Qasem Soleimani from the grave,
Yeah.
whether the Trump administration's foreign policy was quote unquote isolationist. So the war continues, obviously, in Gaza, and you have seen the bringing back to the surface of discussions of the so-called peace process with the so-called Palestinians. And you've seen the Biden administration, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, who has leaked to the media that the U.S. State Department is allegedly considering plans to formalize a so-called Palestinian state for the first time in American history. And because of all these trends, because of the war, you've now seen a lot of people talking once again about the history of the region of Israel and so-called Palestine. And there was just so much misinformation on this, Yair, as you know, perhaps better than anyone. I've explained it on this show before about how the PLO was basically created in the 1960s as a Soviet Kremlin psychological warfare operation. They literally recruited Yasser Arafat out of exile in Tunisia, brought him back to Ramallah. I mean, the whole thing is just totally upside down, insane. You wrote a great piece for Newsweek back in October 2022, Why the Jewish People Are the Rightful Owners of the Land of Israel, really going deep on the history of the region and just disproving this lie about how 1948 was a so-called Nakba, about how the Arabs are the indigenous people to the land there. Why don't you start to walk us through some of what you wrote in that piece? Because that history, frankly, has never been more important than it is right now, while the United States is not so subtly flirting with the idea of a so-called Palestinian state.
Right. So, by the way, you mentioned the PLO and their creation by the Soviets in the 1960s. So that's very interesting because the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was created in 1964. Israel took control of the West Bank, what we call Judea and Samaria, according to history, it's Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem and Gaza in 1967. In 1964, the whole of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza were in Arab hands. Jordan controlled the West Bank, and Egypt controlled Gaza. So which Palestine did they want to liberate? They said in the charter, not the West Bank and Gaza, that should stay at the hands of Egypt and Jordan. But the core of Israel, Tel Aviv, West Jerusalem, Haifa, the whole country of Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza, it's in the size of New Jersey. So it's very, very small. And again, Yasser Arafat, that was the biggest leader of the Palestinians, was actually Egyptian, that was born in Cairo. Right. And again, even their flag is identical to the Jordanian flag. They couldn't even be too creative with their flag, Going back, so there's many layers. There's modern and ancient layers. Going back, like, where does the name Palestine came from? So the name Palestine, okay, going back 2,000 years, at the time of the Roman Empire, what is the Holy Land, Israel and the whole surroundings, was officially a province of the Roman Empire called Province of Judea. That was the official name throughout, any archaeological, or historian can approve that. That was the official name of the province. There were many, like in the United States, there were states, there were many provinces in the Roman Empire. There were province of Italy, province of Gaul, that was France, province of Britain, etc., etc. And Israel and province of Judea was one of those provinces, with mostly inhabited by Jews, as the name applied. It's also mentioned, when you read the New Testament, it says again and again that Jesus was born and raised in Judea. That was the official name. Judea, the Galilee, that was, the northern province of the Judea. It was inhabited by Jews. Now, the Jews rebelled against the Roman time and time again. And in 120 AD, there was a big revolt called Bar Kokhba revolt, when the Jews rebelled against Emperor Hadrian, the same guy that built the famous wall in England. And Hadrian was really upset because the Jews managed to get to push out the Romans and get independence for 1 year. He brought all the legions throughout the empire to crush the revolt. And of course, the biggest superpower in the world managed to do that. They crushed the revolt. And they killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, took hundreds of thousands of Jews to slavery. And one of the punishments was to change the name of the province from province of Judea to province of Syria, Palestine. So where does the name Palestine come from? The name Palestine came from the ancient Philistines, that the Romans knew them as the ancient nemesis of the Israelites. Now, the Philistines had nothing to do with Arabs or Islam, of course. They were an ancient people coming from Greece to invading to the Eastern Mediterranean around 3,200 years ago, 3,200 years ago, 3,200 years ago. And the name Plishtim in Hebrew means invaders. This is how the ancient Israelites called them, because they came from the sea, invaders. We don't know how they called themselves because they had no written language. And at the time of the Romans, 2,000 years ago, they were already long extinct. They got together with the 10 tribes of Israel at the time of the Assyrian occupation and exile. They got exiled throughout, this empire around 2,600 years ago, and disappeared from the pages of history. That means that at the time of the Romans, even, they were long gone, 2,000 years ago. But they just named it in order to, to make it more painful for the Jews, naming it under, the same name, their ancient nemesis. We also know for a fact that they were Greek people, the ancient Philistines, and have nothing to do with Arabs, because we have their graves, ancient graves throughout the coast of Israel. And when you extract the DNA from this coast, from this bones, you see that their DNA is Southern European and Greek. But because the Romans changed the name to Palestine, it got stuck in European languages, like everything, like the ABC we use, the month of the year, everything from European languages and culture eventually comes from the Roman Empire. So the name of the geographical area of the Holy Land was named Palestine, the same way that you would call North America. It doesn't apply on any ethnicity or people living there. In fact, fast forwarding, almost 2,000 years to modern time, where when the Holy Land was under Turkish control, the Turkish Empire for 400 years, there was no Arab state or Muslim state with independence in the land of Palestine with the capital Jerusalem. Never. It was always a part of other empires since the Jews lost their independence. And under the Turkish Empire for 400 years, it was not even a province of its own. It was part of the Syrian province with the capital in Damascus. And you have American and European scientists and authors, and they came to the Holy Land, for example, in the 19th century. And for example, the famous American author Mark Twain visited the Holy Land in the 19th century and wrote a book about it. And he described an empty and desolate land with, no people, almost no people. And he was not a Zionist, he was not a Jew, it was before Zionism. That was in the middle of the 19th century. Actually the only people that called themselves Palestinians were the Jews. Bank of Palestine was a Zionist bank.
The Jerusalem Post was literally known as the
Jerusalem
Palestine
Post, which is
Post.
the Zionist Israeli newspaper, was used to know as Palestine Post because when the British in the First World War, the British were in war with Turkey, and they took over the Holy Land and named the and got gained control from the League of Nations that preceded the UN. They get control of the Holy Land in a form of mandate, meaning that they control the Holy Land, but for a temporary amount of time. And the mandate was called, they called it British Mandate of Palestine after the ancient Roman name. And the only people that called themselves, again, Palestinians were the Jews. The Arabs actually called themselves Southern Syrians or just Arabs. And while they got from the League of Nations the mandate to Palestine, they you need to specify who are the natives that's supposed to inherit the land once they're, because again, mandate is a form of having a colony, but for a temporary time, not forever. So you need to specify who's supposed to inherit the land, which kind of native is supposed to inherit the land. And it says specifically that the Jewish people are the only inheritors of the British Mandate of Palestine. It says it was agreed in the San Remo Agreement of the end of World War I in
1920,
1920.
I think.
1920, exactly. It was the 1920 San Remo Accords were like all the winning powers of World War I came together and split the Middle East and Europe again after the war. The Turkish Empire, which was already Turkey, ceded the Holy Land to the British government. So Britain was legally in control of the Holy Land. And in the British Mandate of Palestine, they adopted the Balfour Declaration calling for a Jewish independent state in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel, in Israel. And it was later ratified in the British Parliament, becoming part of British law, in the US Congress, becoming part of American law, and all the League of Nations mandates when the UN was created after the Second World War was automatically adopted. So it's actually part of the UN Charter, believe it or not. Quite ironic, based on the UN, behavior. So this is binding international law, and it's including all of the West Bank, Israel, and the Gaza Strip. And the status never changed. When Israel was created in 1948, was declared, all the Arab countries surrounding Israel declared war and invaded Israel. And the Jordanian army crossed the Jordan River and managed to occupy what they call the West Bank, because I come from the East Bank of the Jordan River. And the Egyptian army invaded and managed to occupy the Gaza Strip. So the new line between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza was only a ceasefire line with no legal basis. It was only where the forces stopped fighting, ceasefire line. Actually, at the end of the 1948 independence war of Israel, Israel approached Jordan and Egypt asking to let's make the new ceasefire line an international recognized border. And they refused because they didn't recognize Israel as a country or that has the right to exist. So it was never became a part of international law. In 1967, when Israel was attacked and defended itself and took control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, it actually brought back to its territory what it belongs to its territory according to international law, according to the San Remo Accords and the British Mandate of Palestine in the Balfour Declaration. So that's like
Yeah.
history.
It's actually that's an extremely helpful history lesson. Obviously, I think it's actually probably it's an even stronger case than what you're saying. Actually, believe it or not. So there's a not to nerd out, but we'll nerd out a little bit here. There's a principle of international law called uti possidetis juris, which basically says that when a new legal entity, a new sovereign entity is created, that entity then inherits the borders of the previous entity that existed there. So at the time that David Ben-Gurion declares independence, 1948, Harry Truman, the president, recognizes it within 10 to 15 minutes or so. At that time, the then new and nascent state of Israel inherited the borders of mandatory Palestine, which included all of Judea and Samaria, included all of what the international community refers to today as the so-called West Bank. Yeah, yeah, would love to talk to you for so much longer, but unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time here. But let's go out on this note.
I just want to finish what you. First of all, it's true, and the basis of this international law, thing that you said, it's also the basis of the sovereignty of most African, Eastern European, and Asian country post-colonialism. So, that's why you got the
Yeah.
borders throughout the world in most countries. So that's also very powerful. And also, digging the West Bank, it's the hillside 10 miles east to Tel Aviv. And everywhere you dig there, you find Jewish archaeological, findings from, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. In the Palestinian Authority, the most common last name is El Masri, which means Egyptian in Arabic
Wow.
because they're origin from Egypt. The second most common name is Hijazi, which is an area of Saudi Arabia. The third most common last name is Halabi, which is Aleppo in Syria.
Right.
Most of the Arabs living either in Israel or in the West Bank and Gaza are descendants, not all of them, but most of them are descendants of immigrants that came from neighboring Arab countries at the time of the Turkish Empire and the British Mandate.
So with all that said, this is all correct. I mean, this history is emphatically correct. It seems like the West just does not care. I mean, it seems like most people are either willfully naive or just flat out ignorant. They just don't seem to care about that. And I guess having acknowledged that most of the mainstream media, most of the Western elites at places like the United Nations, the New York Times, the European Union, all the above, they just don't care tragically about this authentic, real history that you and I have just discussed. What would be your message then to those who just continue, despite all of what we just said, to push for this creation of an independent so-called Palestinian state?
So again, the Palestinians are Arab Muslims. The Arab Muslims have 22 countries. Muslims have 50 countries. If you take the land mass of the Middle East, Israel, including the West Bank, it's not even 0 point something percent. So it's not like the Arabs, if you ask the Palestinian, what is the difference between you and a Jordanian? It's like, what, they even have the same flag, well, it's, they speak the same language, they have the same families, they're cousins, it's all, Israel cannot survive with a Palestinian state. The distance from Tel Aviv, which is our biggest metropolitan area, our New York, to the West Bank is 10 miles. And the 7th of October, the terrorists from Hamas invaded from the Gaza Strip to Israel and penetrated more than 20 miles inside Israel. If they would do the same from the West Bank, Israel would be annihilated at the same day if the West Bank was not under Israeli control. Now, let's go back with the example of Gaza. Gaza was under Israeli control, and there were 10,000 Jewish Israeli civilians living there. In 2005, Israel pulled out unilaterally from the Gaza Strip. We kicked out 10,000 Israelis from their homes, they were born in their homes, their parents were born in them for several generations. They had farms there. They lost their lands, they lost their farms. We kicked out everybody, the whole families together with kids, even the graveyards. We took the bodies out of the graveyards, so we didn't even leave the graveyards. And we left the Palestinians there, all the greenhouses and all the facilities and everything. And we said, here, you want a state? Take a state. Gaza will be, you want a state? Gaza will be your state. We pulling out, all the army went out, and billions of dollars of humanitarian aid flooded Gaza from around the world. Actually, more money Gaza received since 2005 than Germany and Japan received after the Second World War.
Wow.
And we're Germany and Japan, and look where is Gaza now. And the liberals in Israel said that wishful thinking that once we pull out of Gaza, it will become the Singapore of the Middle East. It's a beautiful stretch of coast along the Mediterranean. They will build hotels there and, luxury resorts and stuff. My father was one of the few that actually warned that no, like Hamas will take over probably. And it's, they're going to use it as a launch pad to Israel. And since 2005, Israel, the whole of Israel, including our heartland, our capital of Jerusalem, and our metropolitan of Tel Aviv, that is 80 miles from the Gaza, unlike 10 miles from the West Bank, being bombarded in missiles. This is the only country in the world that once in half a year or so the whole country goes in bomb shelters for a few days when there's a skirmish with Gaza. And of course, Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza are committing a double war crime because they're targeting Israeli civilians. They're not firing on Israeli military bases. They're firing their rockets on Israeli towns and cities. And they're firing those missiles from within civilian Palestinian population, from within schools, from within mosques and hospitals, hoping that Israel will retaliate. And then, so they're hoping for the biggest amount of Israeli and Palestinian civilian casualties. And you know, and I hope this war will be the last war with Gaza, and you know, for the sake of the Palestinians as well.
Yeah, God,
Uh,
God willing, it will be. I mean, as you just said, they basically have had their experiment in an independent state since 2005 in Gaza, and suffice to say, it has not ended particularly well.
and not for the Palestinians. The Palestinians, when Gaza was under Israel, there were now you see there's all these casualties because of course Israel have to, you know, to take out Hamas, and Hamas is embedded in the most popular, you know, the most dense population civilians of the world. They're embedding themselves inside schools, inside, you know, kindergartens, among civilian populations. So of course, the amount of civilian casualties high as well. And there was, when Israel controlled Gaza, there was no casualties compared, you know, statistic compared to these numbers. There was, you know, it's nothing. The civilian casualties in Israel and in Gaza when Israel controlled Gaza compared to what it is now after we left Gaza and gave them independence and gave, you know, completely pulled out of it. You know, it's important to know that.
Yeah, the economy, by the way, was also much stronger in Gaza back when Israel actually controlled it. The
Of
GDP per
course, they
capita
loved it.
was shockingly higher than it is now in real inflation adjusted terms. Yair Netanyahu, God bless you, my friend. I hope you stay strong throughout the months that are ahead. Thank you so much for joining the Josh Hammer Show.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.